So, welcome. Before we get going, let me just give a quick background on the Sustainable Wash Systems Learning Partnership, which is the organization that sponsored this research that we're going to be talking about today. So under Sustainable Wash Systems, we have 8 partners working with USAID to test new ideas, approaches, and tools to strengthen local wash systems in order to improve service sustainability. And we started with the premise that strengthening a local system means engaging with the actors in that system and also understanding and addressing key factors, such as financing, that can help or inhibit sustainability. At the same time, SWS teams are working in partnership with local stakeholders in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda to apply and test new solutions to sustainable wash services, including collective action approaches. And through this partnership, which is nearly at the end of its final year, SWS work to better understand how people understand and engage with systems, how we can apply collaborative approaches to reach solutions, and how professionalized maintenance services can help to solve the rural water sustainability challenge. Today's webinar will focus on the problem of collective action, and specifically how programs can be designed and managed to mitigate challenges and risks and make progress on collaborative outcomes. Great, so let me show you the agenda for our session. So we're going to start with about collective action, then we're going to do a comparison, we'll be sharing our findings and lessons from the research, and then we're going to have some of our local facilitators, people actually doing collective action for the last few years. We're going to hear from them about their experiences, challenges, and lessons, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Throughout the session, though, please put questions in the chat, and we'll be taking note of these, and we'll queue them up for the presenters at the end. So no need to hold your questions to the end. Great. Okay, so about collective action. So what is this? Well, as you know, many governments, especially in less populated areas of low and middle income countries, are behind in establishing robust systems and arrangements for wash service provision. This is why we have a World Water Week. Major and systematic challenges such as rapid urbanization, water scarcity, and humanitarian emergencies further complicate reform efforts. And overcoming these challenges really exceeds the mandates and capabilities of any single entity. And that ultimately requires collaborative approaches amongst multiple stakeholders. So due in part to their recent emergence and inconsistent terminology, collaborative approaches, including collective action and collective impact, they're understudied in the wash sector. And this is the gap in evidence and guidance that we aim to fill with this research across all these cases. Next slide, please. So this is our learning goal, to understand the benefits, costs, and appropriate uses for collective action approaches. And then our learning activities underneath this were to, first of all, try and define collective action approaches in WASH. What are they? What are they not? There's a lot of jargon and a lot of sort of talk in the sector, and we wanted to try and narrow down what are we talking about? What do we want to learn from? And then next, to investigate what factors and design decisions can drive progress. So what are really the key levers within these that might lead towards success, or what might be some of the bigger risks? How do these things interact? And then we also did look at costs and benefits of different design decisions. And that topic we'll be covering in more depth in our closeout event in a month, but we won't be able to get to today. So we'll cover these first 2 pieces. So next, these are our cases. So there were 11 cases in our study, 9 from SWS and 2 from other partners who we were lucky enough to be able to include in our study. And these cases in Ethiopia at the district level are Mile, South Omo, Debre Birhan, Waliso, and then with Millennium Water Alliance, they're working in 3 districts in Farta, North, and Maka. And then in Uganda, Kabarole, Kamuli, Kumi, Nakaseki, and then with partners USAID's Sanitation for Health project. They're working on a national sanitation marketing campaign at the national level. And then finally, Kenya in Kitui County, there's a WASH program there. So those are the 11 cases. It's a little bit of a grab bag, but we were able to really find lots of interesting similarities and crossover and differences and things to be able to pull out and try and understand. Next slide. So defining collective action. This was our first activity. And we went about this through an extensive literature review. We talked to dozens of experts in collective action outside the WASH sector. We talked with the teams implementing these collective action approaches in the cases. And this is what we came up with. Next slide, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. So a collective action approach in WASH we defined as a process for improving a public service where sectoral stakeholders regularly convene and take joint actions to address shared problems. And importantly, in which problems are complex and solutions require deliberation and action by many members. Members agree on shared vision and problem definition, and stakeholders clarify responsibility for service provision and hold each other accountable. So it's a little bit of a wide definition. We really wanted to see, what can we learn from the broad spectrum of approaches, and this is what we came up with. So let me now hand over to Kimmy, who's going to talk more about the analysis that we did and how we got there, and then the findings that come out of this. So Kimmy, over to you.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Pugel at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm the primary researcher on SWS's collective action work. Next slide. So I'll focus today on the second part of our collective action learning in SWS, which is investigating what factors and decisions can drive progress of collaborative approaches. Next slide. The question we sought to answer was specifically what combinations of factors contribute to progress of collaborative approaches in WASH. To answer this question, we collected and synthesized data across those 11 cases of collaborative approaches that Sean presented on. Our data sources included over 100 literature sources, 40 interviews, and over 4,000 pages of documentation that spanned more than 3 years of records. Using all of this data, we investigated about 40 factors to understand the role that they played in driving progress. The comparative analysis started by qualitatively coding all that documentation and converting all of that qualitative information into comparative values that emphasize the differences between cases. We then synthesized all those comparative values using a method called qualitative comparative analysis, which is like a cross-case comparison, but is a more structured and systematic comparative method than normal traditional cross-case comparison methods. It uses fuzzy logic and set theory to pinpoint meaningful factors and highlight the most important trends. Our field experts were also highly involved throughout the analysis process. We consulted with them regularly, and once we had results, we convened all of the field experts to interpret the results as well. So a lot of what you'll hear when I start going to the results builds on all of the lessons they've built over their careers. Next slide. Before getting into the factors, it's really important to discuss what we meant by progress. We defined the outcomes that the cases were trying to make progress on as the specific activities or action areas decided on by the collaborative, such as a fecal sludge dumping site or a countywide monitoring database for water points or a certain policy related to water or sanitation. To assess progress on those outcomes, we actually looked at two measures. First, we assessed the degree to which the activities were implemented, which is up on the screen, different incremental steps toward progress. So such as when buy-in was obtained by key stakeholders, when resources were mobilized, or when implementation actually started or was completed. And then the second measure was the relative difficulty of all those outcomes. If you go to to the next animation. Thank you. We identified 7 aspects of an outcome that could make it more difficult to achieve. That was if it was unfamiliar, required widespread change, required policy change, was multifaceted, was controversial, or was dependent on stakeholders distributed either horizontally or vertically. So for example, in one town in Ethiopia, implementing a fecal sled dumping facility was controversial because there was a longstanding conflict about which entities would be allowed to dump at the facility, and because its establishment meant stronger regulation of some of the predominant industries. So it was controversial. It also relied on actors from the health office, environmental office, water utility, and the sanitation municipality, which meant it was dependent on stakeholders distributed horizontally. It also required policy changes on the part of the environmental office to pass new policies related to fecal waste disposal. So despite those challenges, this case was still able to construct a temporary facility back in 2020 and have already drafted plans and mobilized resources for the construction of the long-term facility. So that's just an example to get you thinking about what we mean when we're talking about the progress, being both how much, the degree to which it was implemented and how difficult it was. And we combine these 2 metrics into a single measure of progress made. Of our 11 cases, 8 ended up making progress on difficult outcomes, while 3 did not. And those 3 cases that had stalled progress are used as counterfactuals throughout the analysis. Next slide. 5 of those 40 conditions that we looked at work together in different combinations to drive progress on difficult outcomes. And since these factors are going to appear multiple times as I go through the results later in this presentation, I'm going to take a minute to define all 5 of these. You can also reference our glossary, which is in the Files tab on Pathable. The glossary file has definitions for each of these 5 written up in case you want to reference these, but I'll also go through them now. So local government uptake means that relevant decision-making entities in the local government act based on recommendations made by the collaborative. This could include contributing financial or in-kind resources to their activities, expanding annual government budgets related to the topic, or passing policies or resolutions. The second factor there is hub with convening power, which has sort of a 2-part definition. So first, hub is the entity that manages all logistics, facilitation, leadership, and other administrative functions of the collaborative. And then second, it's important that the hub has significant convening power, meaning that they have the influence and ability to bring people together for meetings and other activities. We saw that there were 2 main ways that significant convening power could be gained. The first is when the hub was actually a government entity that was respected, had decision-making power, and held a mandate related to the topic of the collaborative. And the second was when the hub was a non-governmental entity, like an NGO, that had a long history in the area before the collaborative began and had working relationships and high respect, expertise in the subject area, strong local knowledge, things like that. The third factor is collective problem identification, which means that key problem areas that the collaborative will address are defined by the members of the collaborative themselves. So this is opposed to the problem areas being defined before the collaboration starts and having the collaboration focus their efforts on implementation and action. So this is, again, the focus on or having the problems collectively identified. The fourth factor is external funds for activities, which means that funding is available to the collaborative from external sources, specifically for the implementation of activities, not just for meetings. Some examples of funded activities in our studies included the database establishment, policy development, master planning, or infrastructure construction. And then finally, continuity and accountability means that member organizations consistently send the right representatives and members feel accountable for actions. Great. So these 5 factors work together in different combinations. But before getting into those really interesting combinations, I do need to cover some really important contextual factors in defining characteristics. If you go to the next slide. So we had, again, 40 factors that we looked at, and ultimately 13 didn't really vary significantly across our cases. And so while this lack of variation meant that we weren't able to look at the role that they played, they're still really important to acknowledge here because they may have helped set the stage for those 5 factors to drive progress. So for example, I talked about having a hub with convening power being really important. One of the factors that didn't vary is having that hub have adequate staff capacity and facilitation skills. And so that's really important as a piece of the factor of hub with convening power. So I'll cover these briefly, just so that it sort of helps set the stage and the context for all the rest of the things I'll get into in a minute. So in all 11 of our cases, members were autonomous stakeholders. Each of them played an important role in water or sanitation service provision. And because of this, their roles depended on one another to some degree. So they were interdependent. Members voluntarily showed up to meetings. The meetings were not mandatory, but they still felt decent external or internal motivations to be a member. Power differences existed, but members generally did not explicitly leverage them to influence decisions or discussions. In every case, both technical and decision-making government entities were either members or were highly engaged in the collaborative. All of our cases were facilitated transparently by a hub entity with strong capacity. Again, that hub meaning that leading and facilitating organization. And under the guidance of that hub entity, the members reached a shared vision and frequently interacted both in and between meetings. All of our cases attained some small achievements early in the process and all found ways to adapt their process. So again, this is important. It helps lay the groundwork for those 5 other factors and is really important context for the next results. So next slide, we'll dive into the pathways to progress. So we had 3 unique pathways or combinations of factors that explained how a certain number of cases made progress. In the first pathway, progress was made when the hub had convening power, which allowed the hub to rally stakeholders around the effort and strengthen the continuity and accountability of members, which ensured members followed up on the action items they were assigned. Cases established this continuity or this accountability either through, you go back one, Elizabeth, thanks, sorry. They established this accountability either through activity tracking, such as an annual work plan, or progress tracking, such as through agreed performance indicators. But these 2 factors alone were not sufficient for progress. Government uptake was a critical 3rd piece of the puzzle that allowed these cases to make progress. It is important to note that cases in this pathway with these 3 factors benefited from a stable enough political environment that continuity and accountability could be established. In contexts with high turnover or unpredictable political dynamics, it was harder to gain continuity and accountability, but that doesn't mean that those cases weren't able to make progress. Next. So the second pathway, in this one, the hub still had convening power, but faced with inconsistent membership, they instead focused on securing external funds for activities. This, paired with local government uptake of recommendations, was sufficient for progress. So again, this was not all cases rely on continuity and accountability. And then finally, not all hubs are going to be able to have convening power. So in our third pathway, the third pathway showed that progress could be made when problems are identified collectively by the collaborative, when external funds are secured to fund those solutions, to the solutions that were collectively identified, and when local government, again, was obtained. These 3 pathways reliably explained progress in all 8 of our successful cases and our 3 counterfactuals, which is shown by the relatively high validity measures on the bottom of the screen. I'm not going to get into it, but in qualitative comparative analysis, values greater than 0.8 are considered to be very strong and reliable. And so these indicate that our pathways are reliable. These pathways, as you probably noticed, have a lot of overlaps. So for example, all 3 relied on local government uptake. Next slide. So it's actually the investigation into these overlaps that I think reveal the most important takeaways and trends. So as I walk through some of our takeaways, I'll display the pathways and their overlaps in this way. Next slide. So the first takeaway is that local government decision makers taking action in response to recommendations by the collaborative was the only factor that was absolutely necessary for progress, meaning it was in all three of our pathways. So for example, the Deborah Brahan Learning Alliance in Ethiopia was able to construct a fecal sled jumping site for a lot of reasons, but definitely in part because they were able to convince the town administration and the mayor office to allocate budget for its construction. For folks who have worked in the WASH sector for a while, those of you in the audience, this is probably not very surprising. Water and sanitation services are public services in many places. So by definition, they rely on government buy-in and action. And that's just the way that WASH works in a lot of places. But even though this is a bit of a straightforward finding, I think it's still really important because our cases have demonstrated that it's still really hard to secure this necessary government uptake. Signing a memorandum of understanding does not guarantee uptake. Involving government as members in the collaborative we saw also was not enough to secure uptake. Once it's gained, it can be challenged by turnover and shifting priorities come election season. Government actors are juggling a lot of different responsibilities. There's a lot of reasons that it's really hard to secure uptake. And so ultimately, I think the message here is that every single effort that a collaborative makes to advocate and demonstrate value for their recommendations has paid off by helping to attain government uptake and ultimately make progress. Next slide. The next takeaway is that establishing a consistent and accountable membership can be one really important step to progress. And that's generally recommended in guidance for collaboration or collaborative approaches. So in the Waliso Learning Alliance in Ethiopia, in their 7th meeting, for example, only 1 out of 25 participants was a first-time attendee. And mostly all members feel very accountable for action items that they're assigned. That being said, we saw a lot of our cases that were not able to achieve continuity and accountability because they didn't have that stability that's needed that I talked about a little bit before. So when there's frequent turnover of government staff or shifting priorities due to emergencies, you can't always achieve continuity and accountability, but our main takeaway is that that's okay. 2 pathways were able to make progress without continuity and accountability. And so if that's just not possible for your context, there's still other ways to make progress. Next slide. The third takeaway is that external funds for activities can really help drive progress. And again, this is funding not just for meetings, not just for the hub, but actually for implementation of activities. And that it's particularly important in contexts where continuity and accountability cannot be ensured. The South Ari Learning Alliance in Ethiopia, for example, had access to funding to set up an asset monitoring system and database for monitoring scheme functionality. We know that this is a bit controversial of an idea, both because guidance on collaborative approaches assumes that the members themselves will be able to front the resources, and because we know in the development sector that funding can create dependencies in the long term. But overall, our results still show that for the first 3 years of a program, funding can be necessary in some contexts, but not all contexts again. And next slide, finally, our last takeaway is about collective problem identification. Collective problem identification, again, means that the collaborative identifies problems through the collaborative process, rather than problems being identified before the collaborative forms, for example. The Kabarole District WASH Task Team in Uganda is a really great example of this. They formed with the sole task of helping their district reach universal access to WASH by 2030. All of the task team members brought their unique knowledge and expertise to the table, and with the help of a comprehensive systems assessment conducted by IRC Uganda, they identified 3 main problem areas that they were going to tackle to help achieve universal access. Collective problem identification is generally recommended in guidance on collaborative approaches. Some even say that without collective problem identification, an approach technically isn't a collaborative approach or collective action. But while we saw that it was very critical in some contexts, this was only one of the 3 pathways to progress, meaning that there are still routes to success if a program requires problems to be predefined. So if, for example, certain program funder constraints require certain activities, or if an implementer wants to make sure that they're aligned with government agendas before the collaborative even starts. Next slide. So we're excited to announce that these results were actually just accepted to the Science of the Total Environment journal last week. And a preprint of the manuscript is available online as of yesterday. So it's great timing. Currently, it's only a preprint, or the preprint is only available for institutional access. It's not open access. But once we finish all the processing in the next week or so, a free open access version will be available at the link that's someone could hopefully put in the chat. And then also in the files tab of Pathable, there is a link to that journal article, that place where the final formatted version will be. And then also there's a graphical abstract that we've also uploaded to the files tab. But also feel free to contact me if you'd like a copy of the preprint, which I'm happy to share. I put my email up on the screen there if anyone wants to note it down. And then next slide. With that, I will hand it over to our field experts to share more nuanced details from their really in-depth experiences from implementation. Mohammed will run through the background on 3 of the cases in Ethiopia. Desta will describe some of the challenges, and Bethlehem will summarize some of our really key lessons. So thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to them.
Thank you. Hi all, this is Mohammed Ibrahim. I'm going to present the background of the 3 Sustainable Wash Systems Learning Partnership cases on collaborative approach. Those are Kabarole District Wash Learning Alliance from Uganda, South Ari Warada, and the Debra Brahan Toll Learning Alliances in Ethiopia. Next slide, please. The Kabarole District Wash Stakeholder Forum was formed in March 2017 with a member from local politicians, technical staff at district and sub-district level, journalists, private sectors, and civil society. IRC dedicated her facilitator to coordinate the collaborative approach to provide strategic direction for Kabarole District in order to gain universal wash access, focusing on areas of political engagement, capacity of the local government, and community involvement. Next slide, please. Debra Brahan is a small town in Amhara region, Ethiopia, established a collaborative platform called Learning Alliance in September 2018. Its members are from town and Kabyle level government, civil society organizations, and private companies. The Alliance developed its vision to contribute and advise on health and sanitation topics to see healthy and clean town by focusing on 2 important management areas. 1, strengthening the management of shared latrine facilities, and 2nd, building consensus on the management of fecal sludge dumping sites. Next slide, please. The South Ari Warada Learning Alliance is a platform composed from local government wash offices, non-governmental organizations, and community representatives like WASCOSH and water user associations. The first establishment meeting was in November 2017, following different baseline assessment, presentations, and discussions. Its vision is to contribute and advise Warada wash sectors to achieve wash SDG targets, and also decided their focus areas on monitoring, maintenance, and wash financing. Next slide, please. As example on the startup of collective action process in South Ari. First, initial consultations and assessments. Consultations with key decision makers and other wash stakeholders in order to conduct baseline assessment with the involvement of the Warada stakeholders to start up collaboration with the local government. following these consecutive discussions on the findings and recommendations. Secondly, formal agreement and establishing steering committee. Memorandum of Understanding signed between RC WASH with the region, zone, and Warada government, and then terms of reference developed structurally to guide the Learning Alliance activities. Then, visioning and deciding action areas. The Alliance developed its vision and then identified its focus areas on monitoring as an entry point for advocacy on financing and improved maintenance. Second, strengthening maintenance arrangements for rural water supply. And third, strengthening financing for WASH services through the development of WASH SDG Master Plan. During the journey of the Learning Alliance, the Warada Water Office oversees execution of action points. As a chair of the Learning Alliance, the Warada Water Office follow up implementation of the Alliance Plan of Action and reporting back to the Learning Alliance meeting. If the Alliance need financial and technical support from the project to implement its plan, the Warada Water Office requesting REC WASH with the official letter on behalf of the Alliance. Next slide, please. Some of the outcomes, as an example, from Kabarole, District WASH Master Plan approved. Learning Alliance now a key influencer of the local and national WASH decision makers. District government capable to direct and provide inclusive WASH. In Dabra Brahan, secured land for fecal sludge management. Emptying service started in the temporary site. Increased municipal budget allocation for sanitation. In South Ari, maintenance of rural water scheme improved through different capacity building activities to water user stations. Water scheme monitoring systems put in place. Thank you. Hand over to you, Dasta, for your challenge presentation.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm talking few points about the challenges of coalition. 1. Members turnover. The following points are highlight the impact of coalition members turnover. First, members turnover has significant impacts on coalition members' knowledge for how to move forward with clear decision and productive action. Second, it negatively affects established mechanisms for efficient knowledge transfer between old and the new members of the coalition. Third, difficult to constantly sustain collective decisions and actions. Fourth, less productivity and continuity for internal learnings. And the final, adverse impact on collective actions, approach, ownership, and future sustainability. Mitigation measures for members turnover. SWS Hub and Learning Alliance members address the turnover by quickly arranging one-to-one and group formal and informal meetings to orient new appointees or newcomers of the coalition. The second challenge is weak participation from the leadership. We observe that there is a weak participation from the leaders. This doesn't mean they don't like it, but they have many government commitments as they are leading and managing the entire district or town's development activities. Other overlapping priorities when the meeting carried out. The third challenge is accountability. The coalition are a voluntary partnership. It can be difficult to secure regular involvement and participation in working groups. Second, lack of formal accountability, either horizontally or vertically. Due to parallel status and equivalent power relation, there is no legal enforcement mechanism. As a result of loose accountability and the coalition do not have a uniform commitment for group decisions. The work of coalition is additional to the ordinary responsibility of the organization, and they prioritize the individual sector jobs, which lead to less accountability for coalition responsibilities. Next slide, please. The fourth challenge is difficult to build momentum quickly. As everybody knows, the coalition job is a time-intensive process, potentially delaying action and impact on quick wins. Because it needs reasonable time to build actors' trust for implementation and future ownership. It requires time to build the capacity of actors to bring an optimal level of understanding among all members while we are focusing on the collaborative actions. The fifth, the last but not least, is dependency on external facilitation and the resources. Lack of facilitation skills and capacity at many of actor organizations at the beginning of the process. Individual sector organization budget is intact and sometimes not flexible to allocate for coalitions activity. Sector organization need to see the value of coalition before to committed to allocate resources. That means expertise time, finance, logistic, and materials. All the above mentioned challenges are critical for learning alliance coalition, particularly at the beginning of the collective action process. I thank you and hand over to Betty.
Hi everyone, my name is Bethelheim. I work with IRC WASH in Ethiopia as a research and systems strengthening officer and as a learning focal person for SWS projects. I will be presenting about some of the lessons from the learning alliances in our districts in Uganda and in Ethiopia. The first lesson is on entry points. We have found that collaborating with the districts on an area of their interest or priority is a good entry point to create buy-in for establishment of the learning alliances, be it a baseline assessment or development of district WASH master plans. For example, in Saudari and Mile in Ethiopia, several baseline assessments were conducted to start collaboration. One that got the attention of the districts was asset inventory and service level assessment. In this assessment, district water office staff were involved in data collection, which helped with the credibility of the data. The assessment showed the districts the truth about their water service provision, which started the conversation, i.e. an entry point. Further down the line, the same district learning alliance would decide the need for developing Wereda WASH SDG master plans. Another lesson is in Uganda, where IRC had long history in the district. This history with stakeholders made collaboration easier. This also helped in facilitating discussions and reaching consensus. In addition, Tetra Tech working in urban sanitation aligned some of the activities with government priorities, which created buy-in. An example is working on fecal sludge disposal site in Waliso and Dabra Rahan. Next slide, please. The second lesson is on government uptake. When external funds are used, donors have expectations and priorities as well. Finding a way to navigate the interests of both the government and donors is very important. In addition, sustainability of these learning alliances is highly dependent on the uptake and ability of the government to continue activities without external funding. The uptake by the government depends on alignment of priority areas, An example is maintenance and master planning activities in Saudari and Mille, fecal sludge disposal site in Debra Brahane and Waliso. This could also depend on results or tangible activities. A good example is the example I mentioned earlier about the asset inventory and service level assessment. Or it could depend on the capacity of the government to implement action points that come from the learning alliances. Overall, the lesson is that it is good to watch out for consensus solutions that fall outside of hub, funder, or government scope or resources. So these are some of the lessons we have, and thank you for listening.
Great, thanks so much, Betty, Desta, and Mohammed. All right, now we're going to move over to our Q&A, and let me turn off the presenting. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so let me ask our first question. This is from Guy in the chat. He said, interesting that local government uptake was consistent across all 8 cases studied. What about contexts with very little government capacity or willingness, such as in fragile and humanitarian contexts? Do you have any findings that suggest how else WASH services might work? Kimmy, can I pass this one over to you to start?
Yeah, and I saw this in the chat. I think that that's a really great question, Guy. Thanks for bringing it up. One thing that I think is really important to understand is that in learning about government uptake, we've tried to split it up into 2 key steps. The first is getting that commitment from key decision makers. And then the second is actually those decision makers and the government having access to financing mechanisms and other resources so that they can actually carry out those commitments that they made. Many of our cases were working in contexts with limited government capacity. And so definitely some of them did a lot of capacity building to help those government actors be able to carry out their commitments. Also, in some of our cases, and this was actually something I presented a bit in the pathways, was that having access to other funds outside of standard government funding mechanisms also helped initiate some of that action. So, one really important example of this, and Mohammed, Desta, feel free to jump in if you wanted to touch on this as well, but the Debra Brahane Learning Alliance in Ethiopia, after they had identified that one of the really key limitations in their town to healthy, safe sanitation services for all was the fact that there was no fecal sludge dumping facility that was in the town proper. And so they wanted to start to do some work to construct a fecal sludge dumping site. And the town administration, they had a lot of other priorities. And they actually had access to a World Bank funding program that allowed multiple local governments and towns throughout Ethiopia to fund to invest in some of their construction. And so through the work of the Learning Alliance, they advocated to and convinced the town administration that constructing a fecal sludge dumping site was going to be very important. And because the town administration had access to this World Bank funding, they were able to then carry out the commitments that they had made. And so it was sort of both of those two in tandem, like convincing decision makers of the value of something and getting them to actually commit to certain activities or actions, and then needing to find those mechanisms so that those commitments can actually turn into action.
Great, thanks, Kim. Desta, Mohammed, Betty, do you want to add anything there?
Maybe something to add on it is in a district which focuses on always an emergency cases, like in our case, Mille, and in a district focusing always on a development activity is a bit different to have a collective action and a progress, and also especially from government uptake side. So context, as mentioned earlier, is very important and determine the collaborative approach as well as government uptake. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Great. Let me go to the next question. So in Ethiopia, what tools or methodology were used to analyze the status and identify actions for the master plans? Betty, can you say a little bit more about how the master plans were identified?
Yeah, of course. So for the master plans, it actually came from the Learning Alliance. The Learning Alliances in the 8th and 6th Learning Alliance meetings suggested that because the government mostly uses a 5-year or
Oh, Betty, we may have lost your.
Can you hear me now?
We can now. Yeah, just go ahead and try again.
Okay, so to increase the capacity of the government or the district government to achieve the sustainable development goals, the district administration actually suggested the development of the master plan. So it's through the Learning Alliance that this master plan development was suggested. Once the Learning Alliance decided the need for development of the master plans, we actually developed 4 master planning tools so that the government can work on different sections of the WASH sector separately in the planning process. And through different workshops and consultative meetings, these master plans were developed, starting from asset inventory, updating the data, collecting different parts of the WASH system, and then finally developing the strategies for the master plans. Yeah, so we actually have another session tomorrow in this World Water Week on the master planning process we had in the different districts. So, yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Betty. Let me ask Janet's questions. She says, please share insights on how gender and equity are playing out in these areas. Are there intentional gender transformation approaches within the participation aspects? Betty, Desta, Mohammed, can I ask you to take a crack at that one?
Okay, thank you, Sean. Regarding the gender balancing in our Learning Alliance, really it's a very good question, but we have observed that and we believe there is a balance between the gender because most of the health extension workers are part of our Learning Alliance, and also some participants from the town office also participating on the coalition. So there is a very good gender balance on the process of this coalition because there is health extension workers, there is from the municipality also, again from the utility and other sectors participating equally from the other sectors, considering with men and the female. Thank you.
So minor addition on it. When we look at in Mille cases, the women use affair Warada office Learning Alliance member. He is an active member as a facilitator leading the Learning Alliance within the Mille Learning Alliance. This is a best example I can mention. Even he's reviewing and commenting the Warada SDG plan in terms of how women and youth as well as vulnerable groups addressed in the SDG planning process. Thank you.
Thanks. Betty, I want to give you a chance if you've got something to add there. It's okay if not. Okay, let me move on to the next one. So let me ask this question. How do you know who from local government you need buy-in from? Let's start with Betty on that one.
Yeah, so for the Learning Alliance and its action points and its activities to be successful, there needs to be buy-in from their leaders. For example, if an expert comes from the Warda Water Office or Warda Health Office and says that there is a need for a master plan, but the head of the Warda Health Office or Water Office is not agreeing with that idea, then the power of the Learning Alliance decreases. So there is a need for buy-in from the leaders or the heads of the Warda offices. So that's how we know that the Learning Alliance needs power from the heads. It's the decision-making process that actually is affected by this.
That's great. And if I'm not mistaken, you all used some tools also to look at the local networks and to identify connections and relations and missing people from those networks.
Yes, at the beginning, at the beginning, the first thing with the assessments, what the network analysis, the organizational network analysis conducted, that was presented at the launching meeting of the Learning Alliances, and it showed there is a need for collaboration and coordination, and that started the Learning Alliances. And in midway in between, like the 5th or the 6th Learning Alliances, we also asked the Learning Alliance participants if there are any missing stakeholders in the Learning Alliance. And that process also added some of the members Mohammed mentioned earlier, like the washboards or water user associations, the enterprises, the maintenance enterprises, and also private sectors in the Learning Alliances.
Great. Thanks so much, Betty. We're getting close on time, but I think we can do a couple more questions. What should you consider when thinking about who should lead the hub? Maybe, Kimmy, you can start off on this one.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. Thanks, Jeremy. We really focus on hub capacity and hub convening power as two really important aspects of who is the hub. So by capacity, it just means, does this entity have the right, the facilitation skills, the staff time? It requires a lot of time and dedication from people to lead these hubs well, right? And then the other aspect is convening power, which was one of the focus of the presentation that I gave. And that I touched on that a little bit in the definition, but it's mostly about, does this entity have the ability to bring people together to, do they have the existing networks, the local knowledge, the expertise in the subject area? In different contexts, convening power looks different and means different things. But at the end of the day, one of the most important roles of the hub is to get people to the table and inspire them and motivate them to take some of these actions together. And we saw that, sometimes you could get really strong convening power from government, but maybe because these are your limited capacity context, sometimes the government didn't actually have that capacity element to perform all the hub roles. And so an implementing NGO in our cases would then actually support the government as the hub. So the government brought the convening power piece, and then the NGO provided a lot of that capacity piece. And over time, they did a lot of trainings with the government, other capacity building things, facilitation trainings, conflict resolution trainings, so that over the course of 3-4 years, the government was able to take on a lot of the capacity piece of the hub. And so those are the two most important aspects of a hub that we were looking at.
That's great. Thanks so much, Kimmy. Elizabeth, maybe you can put up the slide. We can do one or two more questions real quick, but I want to make sure that we let people know about our closeout event, which will be in a month, which will have a little bit more detailed information. We'll present partly on the resources that it takes to do these. So I'll leave that up, and then let me grab one last question. How do you ensure the sustainability of these approaches? And maybe actually I'll take a quick crack at that. I think one, and then I'd love to hear from, maybe I'll ask Desta to go next, is to think about who is going to be able to lead this long term, and so think about what's your funding versus the local funding, and make sure there is a long-term vision, there is a long-term possibility. And the other thing is that some of these approaches really are trying to sort of catalyze and test something at the local level with national actions going on and testing approach. And so some of these efforts we're looking not to be a 50 or a 20-year intervention, but to catalyze some action, see how it works, see if it can scale. And then it would bump down to a lower level of intensity. So that's one note I want to make there. But Desta, Mohammed, anything you want to add on, or Betty, on the sustainability aspect?
Okay, when you are talking about the sustainability, you see our Learning Alliance, they see the fruit of the coalition support and achievement from the problem identified and working together with different stakeholders. They're really happy to continue with this process. Even when we are conducting our final Learning Alliance, both Tower Learning Alliance are happy to continue allocate resource and also sustain the process for the future. So even we are in field this week, now we are in Waliso, and we are providing how the Learning Alliance are make the decision or the process to facilitate the overall activities, to provide the refresher training on how to just sustain the Learning Alliance, facilitating the Learning Alliance, working with the stakeholders. So we have got a very good feedback from them. We like it. We have achieved separately before the project. We try to just in place the issue or solving the issue of sanitation, but they are not able. But when they are coming together as a collective, and they are really come a lot of activities to implement. So because of that, they are happy to continue, and we expect them it will sustain. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Desta. I think that's a great comment to end on. And we're right at time. So thank you so much to everyone for joining. We really appreciate your questions and your interest in this topic. And we look forward to seeing you at our closeout event. And then we'll also be circulating our final report in a couple weeks. So thanks again. Take care, everybody.